Hello and welcome. Today we shall be looking at the subject of resource guarding. Most importantly, I believe we should be looking at how we prevent it in the first place. Many people will be coming to look at this video because their dog is already guarding to some degree some items in the home. But actually prevention is always better than cure, and I realise you may be listening or watching and thinking, well, that's good, but we do already have the problem. How do we cure it? Well, interestingly, I have found, and as is the case with many behavioural conditions with dogs, is that actually the way in which we set about preventing it is not too dissimilar from the way in which we set about to resolve it. Like many behavioural conditions, we may well see actually quite a large progressive ladder, as I often call it. So, because what I mean here is that a lot of behaviours might be possessive from your dog, but it may be very, very low level. And you may well be able to take something from your dog without difficulty, but you may just see that the dog's a bit grabby or hunched over the item and clearly doesn't really want to give it up. Now, if we see that in a young dog, that's not really a problem, or indeed a dog of any age, because the chances are you're at a very or your dog's at a very low level exhibiting that behaviour, and so the sort of measures in this section will allow us to address the behaviours without too much difficulty. But of course, coming back, we can have some dogs which are much higher up the ladder and much more prepared to use aggressive or domineering behaviours to keep that item to themselves. And in these sorts of cases, we have to consider a lot more things, such as the safety of the person working with the dog and the safety of people around the dog, and indeed we may also need to consider the safety of other dogs near that dog. So I think it's fair to say that if you are experiencing or living with a dog that is exhibiting possessive behaviours to that aggressive extent, then really you need one-to-one help, and that's where I will be glad to take your inquiry and to look at this behaviour with you. Any video that you see, or indeed podcast or any written material, for the best part can only be a generalised approach. And so when we need a more in-depth and support-based approach, which is what I do, then that actually may be your best option. So I just wanted to start at the beginning and maybe go so far as to acknowledge some of the limitations depending on where you are at this point in time. So with that said and done, what I'm going to go through in this video is to show you some little clips I've taken with my own dog, Ruby. Now, Ruby, as many of you will know, is still a young dog. She's only 18 months. I must update her age anytime soon. Before I know it, she'll be 2 years, and I'm still saying she's 18 months. But she's about 18 months of age, and to be fair to her, she has no guarding behaviours. I can take anything off her. I can inspect her body all over. She allows me to do pretty much anything with her. The biggest negative with Ruby, even if that would be a fair criticism, is that, her paws are sensitive during grooming, and it can be quite comical. She'll even lie down with her paws hunched up underneath. But, we can get to them, and in fact, there's a small clip of me grooming Ruby a little later on, and you'll see how she sort of turns away a little. But even that for Ruby is not a problem. So, yes, again, I accept that Ruby is very compliant little dog and wants to please and doesn't have any possessive behaviours, but nonetheless she is great to work with because she allows me to demonstrate to you in a very straightforward way how we can put certain things in place, to, as I say, prevent the behaviour from occurring, which I would like to think a good number of you are approaching the video from that angle, and also some small measures that you can put in place to help reduce any protecting type behaviour. Now, dogs that are showing any signs of resource guarding, as well as looking at the actual guarding behaviour, I'm always very keen to come back to basics and to look at the privileges and the setup for that dog in the home. And depending on how the dog is living with the owners at that point in time, there may also, if during an individual consultation, be a number of measures put in place where we're bringing the dog right back to basics. So just as a quick example, we may be blocking access to the sofa or to the bed, or we may be I may be asking the owner to ignore the dog for certain periods of the day. So these are 2 or 3 things that just popped into my mind where we can do these extra or implement these extra layers to help bring the dog into a more balanced way of being, and to help the dog to understand that it's not actually running the household, and that there are some rules, sensible, balanced rules, to be followed on a consistent basis. And when we have a dog that understands those rules, and in fact Ruby is a lovely example of that, then we have a dog which is much less, in my experience, much less likely to exhibit any guarding or protective behaviours. So if you're living with a dog that is displaying resource guarding type behaviours, your dog is likely to be showing possessiveness around any of the following items. Your dog may be showing possessive behaviours in and around its own bed. Your dog may be possessive over its own bed. Is that the case? Your dog may be exhibiting possessive behaviours over its own toys. It won't let you go anywhere near certain toys. And very often the dog will select 1 or 2 toys that very often it will see as its favourite toys and not let any dog or person anywhere near them. Your dog may be also displaying guarding behaviours over any items which it has stolen, and I think this can present a particular problem for a number of people, because short of getting absolutely everything out of the way so that the dog cannot pick up anything of an unwanted nature, such as remote controls or tissues out of the bin, newspapers, socks, underwear out of the laundry basket, you name it. If the dog can get something it can hold in its mouth and have it long enough to consider that it's his or hers, then you can see guarding behaviours as a result. Dogs can also become possessive of people. Now that is usually applying to the actual owner. So, and of course the owner may be 1 or more people or members of the family. So that can happen. Some dogs will also become protective of their own body, in the sense that they do not like being groomed and see that as an invasion. Now that's a little bit different from having sensitive paws or something of that nature, or flinching a little if you're, being too rough grooming the dog's tail. That's not quite what I mean, but some dogs will not want you or anyone else to touch them in and around their body, and that can be problematic as well for a number of reasons. The dog may not allow itself to be groomed easily or inspected by a vet, for example. So these are areas as well where you may be seeing resource guarding. And finally, an example I'd like to offer is that the dog may be very possessive around food, because of course most dogs, their main subjects of resources are things like, as I say, food, affection. So we've got people and maybe sleeping spaces or particular spaces where that dog might like to rest. So these are classic examples of where your dog may be exhibiting some resource guarding behaviour. So those are some of the examples I'd like to set out for you, and I will drop in little clips of young Ruby doing her best to enact such naughty behaviour. So let's come back on ourselves just a little, because I want to talk again in more detail so I can reinforce this idea about prevention rather than cure. With a young dog, we're looking to demonstrate to the dog that we can remove any item that the dog has access to, whether that's a thing or a place, without a threat, without it being a threat to the dog, and that the dog sees that if you ask it to come off the sofa, or if you're nearby when it's eating, or if you are grooming it, none of these things are a problem. Ideally, each of these items would be addressed one by one, and I'm not going to go into intense depth on each and every one of those items, because there is a lot of information available readily, both on my own sites and on the internet, that gives you perfectly good ideas and sound ideas as to how to show your dog that the removal of these items is not a problem. But the main way I would be addressing this is to do plenty of that practice where you're removing those items in a calm, quiet way, non-confrontational. None of this is aimed at having direct confrontation with your dog, because if that's occurring, then that would suggest to me, and hopefully to you as the owner, that we're going about things in the wrong way. We want to demonstrate to the dog that removal of an item can be traded for something really high value as well. That may be food or another item for many dogs. And that we can play this game, and we show the dog from an early age that swapping items is okay. You asking the dog to, for example, come off its bed, or to jump off the sofa, or to maybe have a brief sit and wait during a feeding session, are all perfectly acceptable things for the dog to take in its stride. So let's come on and look at in a little more detail some of the measures that can be implemented to help address this behaviour if you're seeing it occurring in your home. One of the very first things I encourage owners to do is to regain control of the dog. Now, this needs to be done in a calm, stress-free way. If a dog has an item that it shouldn't have, one thing that can happen is that the dog finds that it's a brilliant game. This is where some of these behaviours start, and dare I say it, some owners may even reinforce some of this behaviour by chasing a dog to get the item back. Of course, I realise they're somewhat forced to chase the dog, especially if the dog has something that is of high value to the owner, or that may injure the dog if it ingests it. So we need to stop any sense of game or chasing if the dog has something that it shouldn't have. And one excellent and simple way of doing that is to put a lead on the dog in the home. Now, that lead will need to be removed whenever you can't supervise the dog. So, for example, at night times, or if you're going out for a short period and the dog's left home alone, then that lead will need to be removed. But the lead is a lovely, simple measure to allow you, assuming your dog has something he shouldn't have, to stand on the lead to stop the dog initially, and then to lift the lead to bring the dog to your feet, and to ask your dog to relinquish the item. Now, that's the tricky bit, relinquishing the item, and I will come on to some exercises later on that you can practice, so that when you get to that point of saying thank you, give, or whatever word you wish to use, that the dog understands it and then actually complies with your request, and that we really circumnavigate any real problems in that respect. So a house lead or a house line is often very, very useful as a first step. That would normally be about 6 foot in length for any dog, and then with some dogs the lead may need to be increased in length depending on, let's say, if the dog was a very large dog, or if he was getting the better of you and moving away before you could even get a chance to stand on the end of a 6 foot lead. So In the home, at the most, you probably could go for 10 feet, 15 feet at the most. Okay, it depends on the size of your home, and also the dog may be exhibiting these behaviours in the garden. If that's the case, then again that longer length would be ideal, if not longer, again depending on the size of your garden. So the house line gives you back control, because if your dog obtains something, we need to be able to address it quite quickly without delay, and using the house line is a very good, quick, easy way of enabling just that. At a relatively early point, I wanted to introduce the idea of the hold and give exercise for your dog. Now, with many dogs that are demonstrating upper level seriousness, this is the sort of program that needs to be really delved into, and that we're putting together a little program whereby the dog is learning to give up items of increasing value. And without setting out a program right here and now, the rough idea here is, let's say you get 6 of your dog's favorite toys, okay, or items, and you could then grade them from 1 to 6, with 1 being moderately interested and number 6 being highly interested, and your dog may even be displaying some poor behaviour or aggressive behaviour around that item. And so what we then do is to spend a few days practicing the hold and give exercise with each of those items, and we work our way up the ladder in succession in keeping with the dog's improvements. Now, I have a specific video which, it must be 10 years old now, on YouTube, but it's one of the more popular videos on my channel, and it's called the hold and give exercise, and I will put a little card just above me, if I get my YouTube skills right, to put a link to that very video for you, and I will also link to that in the description. So please watch the hold and give video, because I go into some detail there with my young boy Max, as he was at the time, and you will see how I introduce him to the concept of the give command, and I talk about tone of voice, and how also we can, or you may or may not, decide to use food as a reward, but that would be my usual recommendation, to reward the behaviour we do want. Okay, so please check out that hold and give exercise video, and to be aware that with some items it's very, very beneficial to work your way through that 6-stage process. You can do more if you like. 6 is usually a minimum, but you may well be spending a few days or maybe a week, depending on the severity of your dog's behaviour, working on each item. So take your time, don't rush it, only move on to the next item when you think your dog is genuinely comfortable to relax that item at that time. Now let's come back to this subject of control, because the line on the dog in the home is exceptionally helpful. But what can also help is that you have yet another layer of control of your dog for short supervised spells, where, let's say, you're sitting down and enjoying a cup of tea, and you just want to know that your dog is settled at your feet and not able to run off and to grab an item that you don't have any immediate control over. So this is what I call the fixing point method. And I usually recommend that you introduce the dog to this concept a few times before you use it for longer periods. So in other words, short periods to begin with, make them short and positive, and then you can build them up and use them for slightly longer periods when the dog is relaxed into that idea. Now, the fixing point method is nothing more than you using usually what is a regular length dog lead, and that would be attached to a heavy piece of furniture. Now, for many people, assuming that they're sitting on a solid chair or sofa, that item will very often have a leg that we can whip a lead around, and then to place a bed at your feet, and then we can put the dog on the lead with a little bit of freedom to move around, stand up, turn around, lie back down again. But we have the dog there at our feet. And this is something I might do with a very young puppy, especially if the puppy, I've had success with this if it's a young dog coming to my house that I've not reared myself, and that the dog may be all over the place initially, and that to try and get some calm downtime in place, that fixing point method can be very useful. And in fact, the fixing point method can be used for a host of behaviours that are occurring in the home. But in this specific circumstance, I'm thinking about if you wish to sit down for a period of time with the dog on the floor, on its own bed, under your control, then that's quite okay to do that. As long as you keep the period and the duration sensible, that the dog has adequate breaks, and that you're not overdoing it, that will give you a much higher level of control without stressing your dog. And so once your dog is on the fixing point, he or she can't run around getting hold of items and giving you the runaround. You have the control back. And so another way of helping ensure that your dog is not able to pick up things that he shouldn't have is actually to go through the home and make sure that it's as tidy as possible, in the sense that there are not items that your dog can pick up that you know he would like to pick up and has shown an interest in before. So make sure things like the laundry basket is up out of reach. Any tea towels or hand towels in the kitchen are not easily within grabbing distance, or kitchen cloths. These are all the sorts of things that people tell me the dog will often get hold of and then not let go of. Any bones or chews in the house which your dog is already finding, or rather displaying possessive behaviours around those, I would actually lift those up as well and reintroduce them as a part of your hold and give exercises within those 6 stages I was referring to just earlier. So we need to sort of go through with a fresh pair of eyes, go through the home, so that we are setting the dog and ourselves up for success, and the access your dog is given to what we consider, or your dog considers to be, areas worthy or items worthy of protecting, we have that control. Okay, so I realize it might be easier said than done, and it can be a bit of a chore to go through constantly making sure that your dog does not have access to things that it shouldn't do, but that is a very valid part of where to begin. Connected to the elements that I was just touching on regarding keeping items tidily out of your dog's reach, we can then look at what access your dog has in the home. So if, for example, you find that your dog likes to steal a hand towel and then run to the top of the stairs and then show possessive behaviour in that area, and if the dog is reliably going up the stairs, then let's block your dog's access to going upstairs. You know, the more, or rather, to put it a better way, the less freedom your dog has during this period of showing resource guarding behaviours, the better, because it comes back under the heading of you having that sense of calm control, that if your dog obtains something that he or she shouldn't have, that you can implement your plan without too much fuss. Another area you might like to consider when dealing with the subject of resource guarding is exercise. Is your dog getting enough of it? Now, well, I'm not just thinking physical, but also mental exercise, games that you can challenge your dog with in an appropriate way based on the breed and the age and the drives of your dog. So think about ways in which you can engage with your dog in a structured, proactive means, because your dog may just be falling short on this physical and mental input, and it just simply really could make your life a lot easier when we think, well, what would happen if we gave half again extra, or maybe what would happen if we doubled our dog's quotient of exercise and maybe more stimulation in a structured way in the home. So definitely something for you to consider. A common area for dogs to become possessive is around food. Now, this is more likely, in my experience at least, to be demonstrated if the dog has something that it considers to be very, very high value, and this can often come about with actual bones or some form of animal offal. So we're looking at bones or dried treats that can be purchased commercially, and with some dogs they may not relinquish that at all, and as a result, in the beginning at least, I would usually advise that those items are not given to the dog because of the potential outcome for aggressive behaviour. It is something that could be reconsidered, and that I was describing earlier, my 6 stages or suggested stages of introducing this concept of hold and give, and with an emphasis of course placed upon the give. But once you are fully through that process and then feel that it's all well tried and tested, then you can go for those real gold items such as bones or similar items that you know your dog was previously very possessive over. Now, one thing I'd like to show in this video is some little clips of Ruby doing what I call eating some mini meals. So Ruby is, as I said at the beginning of the video, very happy to, well, relatively happy to stop eating when I ask her to, but she will do it. She will sit down, she'll back up before her meal is finished if I ask her to, and to be fair, that's very, very rare. But it's good to know that you can do it with your dog if the need was there. Now, a common mistake people make is to sort of effectively challenge the dog and to remove the dog's food bowl whilst it's eating. And whilst this may be well intended, I have discovered that actually this can create a problem more than help address it. Your presence near the dog when it is eating should equate to good things, and actually should equate to the bringer of a higher value item than it's already eating. So, for example, when your dog's in the middle of its meal, rather than to take the meal away, which is that challenge and can then bring out in your dog slightly more possessive behaviours, actually show the dog, especially with young dogs, this can help, and I use a version of this to overcome the same problem if it's actually an ingrained problem. But show your dog that your presence is the bringer of good things rather than the taker away of its food. And you'll see in the video me dropping in some small morsels of high value food whilst Ruby is eating. Okay, so it just removes the stress and anxiety for her that the idea of me being present while she's eating is any sort of threat, as it were. Again, ideally, we would be looking to put in a proactive approach to show a young dog that your presence near its food bowl when your dog is eating is actually not a threat. It's actually a good thing. Many people make the mistake of lifting the bowl away whilst the dog is mid-meal in an effort to show the dog that the human can do this and that it should accept it. Well, that may well work with a laid-back, placid dog, but some other dogs may take umbrage to it and actually demonstrate some guarding behaviour as a result of you removing the bowl. So please don't do that in an effort to teach your dog that you can. It's far better to leave the bowl alone, it is certainly in the first few attempts, and that you demonstrate that your presence will mean that you're dropping in high value treats. And I have some clips of video of me doing just that with Ruby. Later on, once you're confident that your dog is relaxed with your presence in and around the meal, you can then begin to touch the bowl or maybe to make small adjustments to the bowl. And then you could request your dog to sit and to stay, to then lift the bowl, then to add something high value into the bowl, and then to replace it. So those are some thoughts for you on good practices in the beginning with food bowls and meal times. What you will also see is some short clips of Ruby being given what I call mini meals. So a dog which is showing possessive behaviour around its meal, I would then feed the dog, instead of all of the food in one go, I would actually do it over, say, 10, 20 smaller meals. So it would be me holding the bowl, putting some food in, placing the bowl before the dog, allowing the dog to eat that bit of food. Once it's finished, the dog should be asked to sit and to stay or wait, whichever command you prefer. You lift the bowl up, put the second mini meal in the bowl, and then repeat this until all of the food has gone. Now, with some overtly aggressive dogs around meal times, I have resorted to using things like a fixing point on the dog, so the dog may actually have freedom of movement, but it's tethered back to a point whereby the dog can't reach the owner if the dog was making any appropriate lunges towards them. So that is something that can be considered. Also, if you are worried about fingers and hands in the early stages, food can be placed in the bowl via something like a ladle that you could in the beginning tape to a stick. So you may have a ladle on a stick that allows you to stand up and to just lean over and to put the food in the dog's bowl whilst the dog is even tethered back. So those are some little ideas on additional safety measures we can put in place. And as the dog settles down and becomes more trusting of the owner's presence in and around meal times, we can relax measures such as the lead and the fixing point, and the rather than to just dispose of the ladle with the stick, actually what I do is I suggest that the owner shortens it, so ultimately they are having to lean further and further into the dog's space whilst they're eating. So just a few little insights there as to how we can address food possessive behaviour. Whilst I'm on the subject of food and our dogs, please be sure that when you yourself are eating, whether that's at a table, in a dining room, or if you like to sit and eat on your lap in the lounge in front of the TV, that's all fine. But please be sure that your dog is not invading your space and maybe hovering for dropped items, which can happen to us all, or that your dog is under the table or begging on certain members of the family. Please have a good, balanced and consistent approach with your own meal times, so that we're really making sure that the peripheral edges of your dog's behaviour are also sound. Another area that I really think is worthy of discussion with dogs that are prone to guard certain resources, and that is the subject of supervision. You will always need to know where your dog is and what it's doing, and if you can't directly establish that, then you need to have a degree of confidence that there is another person in the home there for you to do that, because you may not be home 24/7, I realise. Even if the dog is on its own at home, I would also then want to ensure that the dog can't gain access to any items that it would guard if you as the owner were present, and so that the dog is not able to practice this behaviour in your absence. So any dog areas that your dog is kept in your absence, presumably and I hope for sensible periods of time, make sure please that it can't gain access to the items that you know your dog would be guarding if you were present. And finally, another area that is really important to ensure that you have control of, because many dogs can display guarding or protective behaviours in these locations, are what I call privileged locations. And what I mean by that, or to give you a couple of examples, is if your dog is helping itself onto the sofa, say, or chairs in the home, or maybe certain rooms in the home, or on beds in the household. Now, all of my dogs do have, albeit with permission only, access onto the sofa and onto the beds periodically, and it's not a common thing, but it does happen. But most importantly, we do control that access. So if you were to be a fly on the wall in my home with the dogs in the evening, they will I may have one or both up on the sofa at the same time, but they will only be there because they've been asked to come up. And equally, I'm content that they will get off when I say, okay, Ruby, off, that they get off without any question. If I were seeing any poor behaviour in those locations, then I would block access to it until I felt that I was on top of the behaviour, generally speaking, and then I could reconsider reintroducing access to those locations. But if you think that applies to you, by all means stop access and guide your dog onto its own bed on the floor, so that it has set locations, and that can help very much with your control and supervision of the dog overall. But after, say, 1 to 2 months, maybe 3 months, depends on your dog and the situation and the amount of work you're able to put in, but then you can reconsider, or rather consider re-allowing access onto those spaces again. But it should be done in the way I was describing earlier, is that you invite the dog on, and you need to be happy that the dog is getting off promptly each and every time. And if you can have that type of arrangement with your dog, you shouldn't actually have any problems. So thank you for watching this video on how to prevent resource guarding and a number of tips on how to deal with it. I hope you found it helpful. As always, please like and share, and that helps other people know that this information is freely available. Thank you, and until next time, take care.